I'm going to take you through this long, very difficult story about Kermit Gosnell, a doctor in Philadelphia. There are a lot of things that go into this story, and I'm going to warn you again, and I'll warn you repeatedly throughout the course of the show today. It will include some very graphic descriptions of what this guy is accused of. Some very graphic testimony from his former workers about what went on in his clinic. And a question later on, why is it that a story like this, once you hear the details, is not being covered by large media outlets? Sherry West was an employee in an abortion clinic who, the abortion clinic was run by a doctor who's now on trial for 8 murders. Sherry West testified in his trial this week that she referred to the babies she saw, both dead and alive, as specimens. She said she used the word specimens because it made it easier for her to deal with. Now, for the purposes of these next several segments, when we talk about Kermit Gosnell and this trial going on in Philadelphia, I'm going to try to stick by this promise because I want to make sure that it's clear. I'm not going to try to hide my feelings about what it is that's going on, but I want to be fair in that I know some people are going to stop listening based on a few things. So, I'm going to try to use the word fetus when I refer to the babies in an effort to be political, because geography apparently is the difference. Because you and I both need to realize that no matter what you want to label the fetuses, the creatures, the specimens, to use Sherry's word, the baby, whatever, they are living beings, and they were at least fully capable of becoming victims. Here's another thing. And I can't tell you that I'm fully comfortable with this, but this is the first and last time you're going to hear me use the word God. Because I know that arguing against abortion using faith and religion stops the conversation for many people. You're arguing on different levels. So you win. And against my better judgment, but with full confidence, I'm not going to bring him up again. Don't have to. Let me say this as a disclaimer again, and I'll say this repeatedly. There are graphic descriptions of some of the most gruesome images you can imagine. If you can't handle it, or if you have kids around and you don't want them to listen, I'm going to let you use your judgment. But I am not embellishing these stories. Much of the information that I am going to tell you is stuff that is either in the grand jury report or was testified to in open court. The grand jury report, I've actually put a link up on the Facebook page, and Brent has put up a link on the website, KFIAM640.com, keyword Gary. I'm not making it up. It's not an easy topic. It's not easy to talk about. I hope it's not easy to listen to. I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other. Abortion is legal in the United States of America for the most part. And in most cases, if you get one early enough, no one cares why. No one cares what your reason is. But this is not an abortion trial in Philadelphia. It is a murder trial in Philadelphia. And it is one of the most heinous murder trials I've ever heard of. And even then, I haven't heard much about it. In my almost 20 years working in radio, I've covered dozens of murder trials. Sat in on several just gruesome, grisly testimony days from medical investigators, from police detectives, etc., describing what it is that they see at murder scenes. Dr. Kermit Gosnell is accused of murdering one woman and 7 babies. Now, the reason I said babies and not fetuses is because that's the way that the state of Pennsylvania is going after him. They were born alive after a botched or careless abortion attempt and then killed out of utero. Remember the geography issue? The doctor referred to that as ensuring fetal demise. And when he wasn't around to use scissors to sever their spinal cords, his assistants would do it. He is charged with third-degree murder with the overdose death of a woman also who went to him for a late-term abortion. His often untrained, underage in some cases, and unwilling assistants, many of whom have now pled guilty to their own murder charges, are testifying against him in his murder trial. And the only reason there are only 8 murder charges and not hundreds, according to the grand jury, is that Dr. Gosnell destroyed too many other records. So fasten your seatbelt, because if this hour doesn't piss you off, you're not listening. Or if you're listening, you're not hearing. And the whole thing started. It wasn't a witch hunt to go stop an abortion clinic. It wasn't motivated by politics or religion or anything like that. This is something that authorities stumbled onto. This started as an investigation into what they believed was a pill mill running out of West Philadelphia, where people were prescribing painkillers, they believed, out of this Women's Medical Society was the name of the clinic. That's why agents went in there originally back in February of 2010. They were looking for evidence that the doctor and the assistants there at the Women's Medical Society were writing prescriptions illegally. But what they found blew them away. I'll read to you from the grand jury report what they found. A disclaimer. Some of this is very, very graphic descriptions of what's been happening. Use your own judgment as far as you want to listen, don't want to listen later on the podcast, whatever. He's on trial for 8 murders, 1 woman and 7 babies. February 18th in 2010, the FBI raided the Women's Medical Society in Philadelphia. February 18th, 3 years ago. And they were expecting to find evidence that it was illegally selling prescription drugs out of there. And when they got there, they realized that this was much more than just a pill mill. I'm going to read to you from the grand jury report here. There was blood on the floor. A stench of urine filled the air. A flea-infested cat was wandering through the facility, and there were cat feces on the stairs. Semi-conscious women scheduled for abortions were moaning in the waiting room or the recovery room, where they sat on dirty recliners covered with blood-stained blankets. All of the women had been sedated by the staff, who happened to have been unlicensed. Instruments were not sterile. Equipment was rusty and outdated. Oxygen equipment was covered with dust and had not been inspected. The same corroded suction tubing used for abortions was the only tubing available for oral airways if assistance for breathing was needed. I'm going to read that line again. The same corroded suction tubing used for abortions was the only tubing available for oral airways if assistance for breathing was needed. There was no functioning resuscitation or even monitoring equipment except for a single blood pressure cuff. The search team discovered fetal remains haphazardly stored throughout the clinic in bags, milk jugs, orange juice cartons, and even in cat food containers. What's not included in that, but is included in some of the testimony by the DA, was that there were also jugs that contained severed feet, with no explanation as to why. Now, the law in Pennsylvania says you cannot have an abortion after 24 weeks, and the doctor admitted to one of the detectives that at least 10 to 20% of the fetuses were probably older than 24 weeks in gestation. 24 weeks, Pennsylvania law. Pretty much the law around the United States, just to generalize, the law is about 24 weeks because that's believed to be the time when most fetuses, once delivered, have a chance at survival. So 24 weeks is a pretty general cutoff. After the raid, Dr. Kermit Gosnell's medical license was suspended. 18 days later, the Department of Health filed papers to start the process of closing down the clinic. The district attorney submitted the case to the grand jury a few months later, May 4th, 2010. Testimony was taken from 58 witnesses and evidence was examined. Until 2009, Dr. Gosnell reportedly performed most abortions before the 24-week period. But it was a reputation that he somehow developed over the course of weeks that he attracted women who weren't allowed to get abortions at any other clinic in town because they were willing to follow the law that put the cutoff at 24 weeks. Again, from the grand jury report, quote, when you perform late-term abortions by inducing labor, you get babies, live, breathing, squirming babies. By 24 weeks, most babies born prematurely will survive if they receive appropriate medical care. But that was not what the Women's Medical Society was about. Gosnell had a simple solution for the unwanted babies he delivered. He killed them. He didn't call it that. He called it ensuring fetal demise. The way he ensured fetal demise was by sticking scissors into the back of the baby's neck and cutting the spinal cord. He called it snipping. Over the years, there were hundreds of snippings. An aside, by the way, hundreds. He's only charged with 7 of them. The grand jury report says there were hundreds of these cases. Again from the report, all of the employees of the Women's Medical Society knew. Everyone there acted as if it wasn't murder at all. Most of these acts cannot be prosecuted because Gosnell destroyed the files. Among the relatively few cases that could be specifically documented, one was baby boy A. His 17-year-old mother was almost 30 weeks pregnant. That's 7.5 months when labor was induced. An employee estimated his birth weight as approaching 6 pounds. He was breathing and moving when Gosnell severed his spine and put the body in a plastic shoebox for disposal. The doctor joked that this baby was so big he could walk me to the bus stop. Another, baby boy B, whose body was found at the clinic frozen in a 1-gallon spring water bottle, was at least 28 weeks of gestational age when he was killed. Baby C was moving and breathing for 20 minutes before an assistant came in and cut the spinal cord, just the way she had seen Gosnell do it so many times. In testimony. Now, the grand jury, by the way, the grand jury report is just that. It's a report. It's not court-approved testimony. But the grand jury report comes from interviews with witnesses. And again, there's no defense cross-examination. But you can imagine that the grand jury report is written by reputable people. How's that? In testimony, one of the employees said, if a baby was about to come out, I would take the woman to the bathroom. They would sit on the toilet, and basically the baby would fall out, and it would be in the toilet, and I would be rubbing the woman's back and trying to calm her down until Dr. Gosnell comes. 2, 3, or 4 hours later, when Dr. Gosnell comes, she would not move. That was the testimony. That she would sit on that toilet until the doctor came. One of the former workers testified in court this week that her job in the clinic, among other things, was to clean up and dispose of the fetuses that women were spontaneously aborting in the waiting room because of the overdose of drugs given to them that were supposed to dilate their cervix. Number one, that's a job. And second, this woman knew that every day she went to work, that's what she was going to be doing. Now, there is plenty more testimony in all of this, and there's more that I have to get into because I have to explain what it is that these doctors, specifically what the guy is accused of doing, especially the murder of the woman that was involved. And we're going to get into some of the issues because as amazing as this story is, that it's been going on and no one knew about it, the questions of why it is that it hasn't been covered, I think, are almost as important as the story itself. This case, just by its nature, is very graphic. So I'm going to let you know again that some of what I'm going to tell you, based on the testimony from court in the last week or 10 days, is very gruesome. It's very graphic. And if you can't handle it, you got kids around, whatever it is, just be forewarned. There's no real other way to explain the story without giving you a full, clear picture of what was going on in that clinic. Several of the people who are testifying against Dr. Gosnell in this case are his former employees. One of the weird situations that has come out of this case is that a lot of these employees were indebted to Gosnell for some reason or another. He gave them a break when they needed it. He gave them a job when they couldn't find one. He would pay them under the table so they didn't have to pay taxes. He would prescribe them medication to deal with whatever issues they were dealing with. And some of the people who are testifying against him were also accused of first-degree murder for the snipping incidents. And a few of them have actually pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, lowering the charge, lessening the charge, so that they would avoid a possible death penalty, which is exactly what's on the table for Gosnell if he's convicted. A former employee, Stephen Massoff, testified in court that it would rain fetuses. Those are his words. It would rain fetuses and blood all over the place. But when you hear that, and if you heard that out of context, you'd say, well, that's only hyperbole. Of course it wasn't. Hold on a second. The other descriptions from the grand jury report, you know what? Maybe it was. Stephen Massoff was a medical school graduate from Grenada who didn't actually have his license. He thought he was doing his residency under Dr. Gosnell, which he wasn't, at least not officially. And he was eventually performing abortions on his own, which is illegal. At one point during his testimony, he was describing the snipping procedure. And he actually instructed the jurors to feel the back of their necks. And he would guide them as they felt the point where he would insert scissors and snip the spines of the fetuses that were born alive. And he told the jurors, it's like a beheading. Elizabeth Hampton actually is a foster relative of Gosnell's wife. She testified in court that she became an alcoholic after she worked at Gosnell's clinic because her task at the clinic included cleaning out the suction machines, pouring out the red liquid, and turning on the garbage disposal. Linda Williams, I referred to her a little bit earlier, she testified she was the one who was tasked with cleaning up the waiting room when the women would spontaneously abort in the waiting room. She also said that when one woman gave birth into a toilet, she saw the fetus's arm move. And she took scissors and snipped the spinal cord, just like Dr. Gosnell taught her to. She said she did it only once and wouldn't do it again because it gave her the creeps. She has been charged with first-degree murder in that case, but pleaded guilty to third-degree murder so she could testify against her former boss and so that she wouldn't be put to death. She also pleaded guilty to third-degree murder in the death of the one woman who was killed at the clinic in a botched abortion. Latosha Lewis testified that Dr. Gosnell performed procedures over 24 weeks, which is illegal, too many times to count, and ones up to 26 weeks very often. In the last few years, Ms. Lewis testified Gosnell increasingly saw out-of-state referrals, all of which were second trimester or beyond. Sherry West also testified this week. Sherry West said that the doctor saw patients who looked pregnant beyond 24 weeks. And again, that 24 weeks is the limit in Pennsylvania. And she said in those cases, even if ultrasound showed that fetus farther along than 24 weeks, Dr. Gosnell would write on the chart 24 and a half. Because while 24 is the limit, gestational age based on ultrasound, there's a little wiggle room. And he would write 24 and a half because it's still within the margin of error for late abortions in the state of Pennsylvania. Sherry West said she hated working in the room where Dr. Gosnell performed the abortions. But there was one night that stood out in her mind, because a staff member asked for help with a problem. There was this clear, these are her words from the testimony. There was this clear glass pan, and I saw it, and I thought, what do you expect me to do? It wasn't fully developed. And she's referring, she said, to this fetus in the pan, somewhere between 18 and 24 inches long. Now, for a quick reference, my son, born in the 40th week, was 21 inches long when he was born. She said that this fetus was about as long as a fully developed baby. Her quote, "It didn't have eyes or a mouth, but it was like screeching, making this noise. It was weird. It sounded like a little alien." She told the assistant district attorney that she would refer to the fetus as a specimen because it was easier for her to deal with mentally. And she testified that she does not know what happened to that specimen. Dr. Gosnell is also accused of killing a woman, 41-year-old woman who had gone to the clinic for a late-term abortion. Things went south. The anesthesia that was given to her was given by an office staff member, not by a trained anesthesiologist. Eventually, she started showing complications. Her breathing shallowed, her skin grayed, and she lost a heartbeat. The people who were working with Dr. Gosnell said that he started to freak out. Those were their words. Freak out. And didn't know what to do. When the paramedics got there, the woman was brain dead. And the paramedics told the police that Dr. Gosnell was just standing there and not doing anything. It was one of his assistants that actually started CPR in an attempt to save the woman. She was brain dead. They eventually pulled her off life support a short time later. Dr. Kermit Gosnell is charged with 8 counts of murder, 7 involving fetuses that were delivered and had their spinal cords severed with scissors. In his words, to ensure fetal demise. He's also charged with the death of a 41-year-old woman who was there for a late-term abortion and is facing the death penalty if he's convicted. I've gone through most of the very graphic testimony about what happened, but I have to throw in some things about what Dr. Gosnell was doing so you get a clear and almost complete picture about what this clinic was about. It's hard to pin down exactly how much he was charging these women for these later-term abortions. But the grand jury says that the grand jury report says he was making somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 a day. Some of the employees also reported they would receive cash bonuses for abortions that they would perform. Anywhere from $20 to $80, depending on how late in the term the abortion was. And the later the term, obviously, the higher the bonus. What I found interesting about this, and perhaps just as disturbing as some of the other things, is that race has become an issue in this case. On two sides. Number one, his defense attorney says the only reason the state of Pennsylvania is going after Dr. Gosnell is because he's black. Last week, outside the courthouse, two black anti-abortion groups said that Dr. Gosnell himself is the racist of the worst kind because he was these are their words, a butcher who preyed on the women and girls of his own race. Employees testified that white patients who went to Dr. Gosnell's clinic, and there weren't that many, but the white patients who would go to Dr. Gosnell's clinic were treated differently. That they were taken to different rooms. They were taken to clean offices. They were treated with sterile instruments so that they didn't contract chlamydia and gonorrhea like many of other Dr. Gosnell's other patients. And one of the employees testified that when she asked Dr. Gosnell why the white patients were treated differently than the black patients, he said, "That's the way of the world, isn't it?" The grand jury report says he likely treated white patients differently because they were more likely to complain to authorities if something went wrong. The National Black Pro-Life Union and a group called Learn Northeast also criticized the state of Pennsylvania for allowing him to operate his abortion clinic without inspection for more than a decade. For more than a decade. No one from the state set foot in that clinic for more than a decade. Now, in the grand jury report, they don't actually criminally go after or suggest criminal charges against anybody, any health official from the state of Pennsylvania. But the report does criticize the state officials for wanting to avoid the controversial political issue of going after a black abortion clinic provider. Let me rephrase that. Going after an abortion clinic operator who happened to be black, who happened to tailor his practice for mostly low-income inner-city and minority women who happened to be black. In 1996, a woman had her uterus perforated, and the state did nothing. In 2002, the state was told that a woman died while at the clinic, and the state of Pennsylvania did nothing because they didn't want to get into the issue. In 2009, when the woman in this case that I've been referring to, the 41-year-old woman, died, the state did not investigate Dr. Gosnell or the clinic. A month after the grand jury report came out, a month after, 4 state lawyers and 2 supervisors at the Departments of Health and State were fired because they didn't ensure inspection of state abortion providers for more than a decade. And the groups out in front of the courthouse want to know why this is not front page story. Why is Dr. Gosnell's name not a household name? And not for good reasons. But why aren't more people talking about it? Why isn't this nationwide, front page, top of the cast, above the fold story? Is it because it's a difficult story to tell? Is it because you can't really tell the story without getting graphic? Maybe. Is it because the media, I'm looking at myself here in the mirror, because the media doesn't like telling stories that are difficult to tell? That's not the case. Is it because the media is this left-leaning organization that doesn't want to put anything out there that might sully the reputation of its desperately held on to rights for abortion? Let me argue that that's not the case, because I don't think I've ever heard of a better argument. If you're pro-choice, okay? If you're pro-choice, you hate this guy because of what he has done to sully the reputation of abortion providers and safe, clean, sterile clinics throughout the city of Philadelphia. You do want the story out there. I love the news. I love this business. I love finding out stories that haven't been told. I love finding stories that interest me. I love finding stories that have been overtold and then trying to find new ways to tell them. I'm lucky because I got 2 hours on a Sunday to do just that. But this is a story that hasn't been out there. The question is, why this story hasn't gotten the national attention that others have. Just a quick scan of the headlines that we've covered over the course of this last week since we last spoke on Sunday. Justin Bieber still hasn't picked up his monkey, and the LAPD continues to be called to celebrities' homes on hoax phone calls. It is a popular story outside of national networks. It's popular on Twitter. The hashtag Gosnell actually trended pretty high all week. In places like Britain, they're covering the story. But the Daily Beast included a picture. Can you see this, Brent, by the way? Empty seats in the trial there. Reserved seats for the media that go empty. Philadelphia Inquirer is covering the story because it's a local story. But outside of that, no national news outlets have a regular seat in the trial. Megan McArdle is a writer for the Daily Beast and for Newsweek, and she's written for other publications, and she is a pro-choice, left-leaning mainstream journalist. Those are her words. That's how she describes herself. And she says part of the reason that she didn't cover this and she hasn't written about it is because she cannot get herself to read through the grand jury report. She faints, basically, at the description of a sprained ankle. She wrote in the Daily Beast, what Gosnell did was not some inevitable result of legal abortion, but while legal abortion was not sufficient to create the horrors in Philadelphia, it was necessary. Gosnell was able to harm so many women and babies because he operated in the open. Connor Friedersdorf actually wrote for The Atlantic a great article about why this is not asking the question, why is this not a front page story? And he says it's not just about a dirty clinic where these horrors were committed and witnessed, and it's not just about fetuses who had their spine snipped. It's not about women who were infected with STDs because of bad sterilization practices, or where a 15-year-old was administering anesthesia, or where race determined the quality of care, or that a clinic was basically ignored for a decade by state regulators, all of which would be massive stories covered by any media outlet of any kind on their own. Each one of those individual stories would have been covered. And you can hear him almost scratching his head as he writes this next paragraph. There is finally the fact that abortion, one of the most hotly contested, polarizing debates in the country, is at the center of this case. It arguably informs the abortion debate in any number of ways and has numerous plausible implications for abortion policy, including the oversight and regulation of clinics, the appropriateness of late-term abortions, the penalties for failing to report abuses, the statute of limitations for killing, like those with which Gosnell is charged, whether staff should be legally culpable for the bad behavior of doctors under whom they work. I have no idea why this is not a lead story. I don't know why Justin Bieber's monkey gets more attention. If this were a slaughterhouse where animals were mistreated, then this would be a front page story somewhere. And someone would have snuck a camera in to document the tortures that abound. If this was a cow where slaughterhouse workers were turning that cow into your tasty hamburger, but instead of knocking them out the old-fashioned way, they snipped the spines of those cows, this would be front-page news. This is the first time that I've truly understood the issue of abortion to be a women's health issue. Stay with me. Because before, it was a comfort issue. Remember how Rush Limbaugh talked about Sandra Fluke and the idea that she wanted the college to pay for her contraception? That thing got plastered over every major news outlet, was covered by every major newspaper, and people lost their minds because he dared suggest that women use birth control so they can continue to have sex without the inconvenience of getting pregnant. There was a study in 1999, I think was the last time I saw these numbers. 92% of the abortions in this country, 92% of the abortions in this country were performed because the women thought it was uncomfortable to have a baby. Now, I'm going to give you the list. They wanted to postpone childbearing. They couldn't afford to have the baby. The relationship problem. They were too young. They wanted to, having a child would have disrupted their education or their job, or they didn't want any more children. Their lives would be uncomfortable. That makes up 92%. 92%. If you're pro-choice, you're pro-abortion, you're pro-women's rights, pro-racial equality in health care, you should be outraged at Kermit Gosnell. You should be outraged at this case. And you should demand that more of your media outlets stop ignoring the story. If you're pro-life, if you're anti-abortion, you should be disgusted that this takes place in this country. You should be outraged that this is legally, morally, physically possible in this country. That a guy like this can prey on the most vulnerable, that the civil rights of these women, and more importantly, that the civil rights of these fetuses are being ignored because of the value placed on them by someone else. If you cannot think of a more despicable reason to take away someone's civil rights than simply because you don't want them or because you would be uncomfortable, I would ask that everyone in my family, all of my friends, all of my coworkers, all of the strangers, all of the listeners, to think about this case, to sit with it. Don't just throw out the line that this is an issue of women's health. It is, but it is so much more than that. If you spent time arguing about gun control after the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, then you should spend time arguing about and wrestling with the issue of abortion with this in your mind, this trial. I know that this story represents a slim percentage of the clinics throughout this country. I know that the vast majority of abortion procedures in this country are done successfully, safely. But when you argue with others or yourself about the issue of abortion, be honest with yourself about what it is. Do not be flippant about the impact that an abortion has on the women who have them, on the doctors who perform them, and the office workers who clean up the waiting room when the women spontaneously abort in the waiting room. The trial is not over. We will probably have to revisit this over the course of the next week. I've probably said enough that it's pissed some people off, and we're going to have to deal with emails through the course of the day. Fine. My email address is on the website. You can post comments on the Facebook page at the official Sunday Morning News. You can blast me on Twitter at Garhoff, Garhof. But do not ignore and do not be ignorant about what this case is about at its heart.